Leswin Laubscher from Duquesne University and from University of the Western Cape, South Africa. He is an associate professor at Duquesne, and his research topics are philosophical psychology, Levinas, Derrida, Frantz Fanon, phenomenology and hermeneutics, qualitative and interpretative research, cultural psychology, psychoanalysis, and psychotherapy. Two publications, Fanon, Phenomenology and Psychology, together with Hook and Desai, 2021 in Routledge, and recent publication, Levinas for Psychologists, by Routledge as well. So, thank you very much for coming. We are really curious. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I am going to try and stay within the time limit and tell the story as succinctly as possible. And to start, I have been teaching a course for a decade now. Every other year or so, it's a study abroad course, and to Vienna, Austria, and Krakow, Poland. It's a short-term study abroad course, and I'll say a little bit about this in a while. But suffice it to say at this point that the study abroad component is an integral part of the curriculum. So students learn, they read, and then about halfway through, just close to halfway through, they go abroad. So it's a 10-day excursus, and then they come back and we debrief and they read some more and they study some more. And the title of the course, and these are just some pictures from some of the students on the study abroad course. 2 years ago was the last time I taught it, but all in all, over the course of a decade, I've taught this course every other year or so. The title of the course is Science, Psychology, and the Holocaust. And it already clues us, I believe, perhaps, into some of the central issues of the course. Not just to study genocide and the Holocaust in particular, but also to pose the question of how to study it as a scholar and a scientist. Put differently, inasmuch as psychology so clearly and adamantly thinks of itself as a science, what and how would it propose or do we study genocide? So clearly the material occasions are wrestling with the different conceptions of psychology as a natural science, as a social science, and as a human science, which is really what Duquesne is very well known for. As for course content, we start with what could perhaps be described as a historical overview of Jewry and Jews in Europe, and of social, religious, economic, political anti-Semitism over the ages, the story of Hitler's rise to power, the unfolding of World War II. But I want to emphasize that I'm not a history professor, and so I include in this story, the historical and political story, questions about human motivation, group process, psychology of the times, the spirit of a historical period, one might even say. We proceed to Freud, Frankl, Fromm, and of course Freud and Frankl both from Vienna, and so that's one of our highlights, visiting their homes when we travel there. But we also survey natural science, a more natural science approach, more natural science psychology approach, particularly social psychology, to the study of genocide. Things like group psychology, authoritarianism, prejudice, stereotype, discrimination, conformity, compliance, all of those kinds of things. And we look at the psychology of trauma, efforts at genocide prevention. We bring in other genocides in the world, Rwanda, etc. Now, I don't have the time to give an overview or background or context for study abroad in general, but I do want to make a couple of points. Firstly, we've come a long way since the likes of Henry James and Thomas Jefferson, or any number of those folks from the 17th, 18th century, for whom newly minted American elite, as it were, for whom the grand tour of Europe kind of served as necessary finishing touches for complete cultural education, as it were. And it is interesting if we trace the history of study abroad in the US, perhaps it is appropriate just to mention very quickly that one of the first fledgling attempts at some organized study abroad has a connection to Germany with Bert Voss at Indiana University, who brought students, he taught in the Germanic Languages Department, and he brought students to Germany in the 1920s, late 1910s. It was mostly an individual initiative, though, and it wasn't up until the 20s and the pioneering work of the University of Delaware, where the so-called junior year abroad came to be. And when study abroad became kind of formalized, if you will, integrated into the curriculum so that students would gain credit for studying abroad, and it was part and parcel of the whole curriculum. Their sojourn abroad was seen as an integral part of their education. And of course, after the war, even more so, was Senator McCarthy, my God, Freudian slip, Senator Fulbright, the Fulbright scholarships, and of course the joint kind of emphases or thematics, if you will, of on the one hand intercultural learning so that we can all get along, a soft diplomacy kind of thing, and after the war, but also, of course, the political agenda in the sense of, in the shadow of the Cold War, and in terms of influence, increasing the sphere of influence. But so now in the 21st century and things shift. There's an explosion of programs, short-term programs like the one I just talked about, Maymasters, summer studies abroad, anything from 2 weeks to 2 months, in addition to the junior year abroad or semester programs. Island campuses. Our university has a campus in Rome and one in Dublin, some of which serve only their own students. Like our campus in Rome only serves Duquesne students. But others open their own universities. For example, between 1998 and 2008, 6 of the most prestigious universities in the US, Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown, Northwestern, Cornell, Virginia Commonwealth, opened in 10 years, each their own campuses with buildings in Qatar. Okay? And so, in fact, now there are 91 American universities in 42 countries with their own campuses. And this is important because there's an economic reason here, too. There's a brand spreading, you know. And this is important, too. Tuition at Northwestern, which is my alma mater, for an undergrad is about $75,000 per year. Okay? An American student, let's say my kid, who happens to be at Northwestern right now in our first year, doesn't pay $75,000 because I don't have $75,000 to give them. And so there's a titrated kind of scale by virtue of my income. But the student in Qatar pays $75,000. So it's revenue generation as well. And the student in Qatar graduates with a degree from George Washington or from Northwestern. And so it's revenue generating as well. And this is important. This is just a little graph for your interest. That 9.3% of all American students study abroad at some point in their curriculum. It is consequently big business, academically and economically. And this is perhaps more of an important point than first meets the eye, because this big business, academically and economically, gives in the early 2000s the demand for research, a demand for outcomes research, a demand from administrators to be able to show to their donors and to their parents that this is what it does. This is why it's important. This is why you have to endow $50 million in order for us to build this campus. It does these things. Yeah? And so now we can no longer rely on the hitherto intuitive notion that study abroad is important. Study abroad broadens the soul, it broadens the horizons, it changed lives, it is transformative even. No, we need outcomes now. We need to be able to say this is exactly what it does, because nothing shows for an administrator and a bean counter perhaps, as well as numbers and statistics, what it does, if you will. And into this demand, then, there emerges or there steps a whole plethora of of assessment scales, measurement scales. The big three are all proprietary, and they are all private. And almost every university buys them and buys the license for them. And they measure things like intercultural competency and all of that, as that little graph shows. And so there's a pre-test and then there's a post-test, and then we see how much the student has grown or where they fall on the developmental thing, polarization or whatever, how little they moved or how much they moved. And thus, the class gets funded again the next time around. These scales, these explosion of measurement scales are not almost, they are without exception of a quantitative sort. And the questions become now, inasmuch as these tools bend to a natural science model, is this overwhelming recourse to quantitative measures appropriate to the existential richness of the study abroad experience? Now, I don't have to argue to this crowd a qualitative or phenomenological research study, and Professor Brinkmann in his opening remarks already alerted us to the, via Heidegger, of the evidence-based concealment of the world. So I'll skip all of that. And I will proceed immediately to kind of what we did. We wanted to know, in a course like this, what kind of learning occurs, how does it occur? And so we invited 10 students, but volunteered. We had pre-travel interviews and we had post-travel interviews. And then we also used the final independent research projects as data, but I didn't use that data for the talk today. It's more of a visual. I can talk about it if we have time. So I want to spend 4 minutes on, just a few minutes, on the pre-travel kind of themes and results, if you will. And I want to do this very quickly because it is not very exciting. It's not very different from what we already know. Students want to travel. And in this sense, we know which places. Vienna is attractive. You know, it's for students. It's a cool place to go to. Much more so for our students than Krakow, for example. The irony, of course, that they end up enjoying Krakow more than they do Vienna, but that's another story. We know that they want to travel because of an academic curiosity of the nature of the course. I come because I want to learn about the Holocaust. I want to learn about genocide. I want to know what went wrong with these Hutus and these Germans and how could it happen and how can we prevent it happening. It's an intellectual and a cognitive exercise. It is, in a certain sense, an inoculation. If we know what went wrong, perhaps we can stop it again. You know, they want to know how did it happen, how did it unfold, what were the dynamics for it. It's a good thing to travel. It'll help me in my job. Those kind of things. These are kind of the themes that came out. I'll go through this very quickly, and you can read on your own. Some very personal reasons. I'm Jewish, my family were survivors, or we left before this happened, or I had a student who was from neighboring, not from Rwanda himself. He said, I want to know what happened just next door to me. Or, as you see, these are some of the other reasons. So, pre-travel interviews, this is not much different from what is in the extant literature. A few little things, few little variations here or there, a few little depthful things, but mostly what we expected. The qualitative, of course, gives it individualizing flesh. It tells the story a little more compellingly, but it is not really that different. It is, then, I'll go through this quickly. Perhaps already at the front end, given the nature of the course, what we did pick up is this, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to break down. I'm afraid it's going to be too much. Emotion is a vulnerability, you know. But other than that, the usual concerns, cautions, oh, I don't want to go there yet, you about travel, about anxieties, will I be able to make friends, and all of the other thematic reasons I've just given you. And then they go, and then we come back, and then I interview them in the first week to 2 weeks. When they came back, and we analyzed, my TAs, 2 very capable doctoral students and I, then took the next few months to analyze the data. And I won't go through and maybe in the discussion we can talk about how we did this. But I'm just going to assume we are all well aware with some phenomenological methodology. What did we find? What happens? What do they report? Firstly, the ineffability of the experience. One of the first things that they say is that there is no language. One of the first things they struggle with is the poverty of general language descriptors. An inability to describe the experience. It's hard to put into words, not really explainable, not possible to explain. The experience robs you of speech. In a Lacanian register, one can say that the symbolic order is subverted by the weight of the real. One might say that the unsymbolizable, that resists integration into language or meaning, erupts into the social order, the symbolic order of custom law and human relatedness with which to navigate the world and each other's. Words lose their connection to things. Communication breaks down. The subject can no longer readily name their position in the world because they have entered a different world, the second thematic. How do they describe this world? They describe it as eerie, surreal, weird, creepy. It is a world unrecognizable from the everyday. For something to be surreal is for it to be beyond limits of reason and logic, for it to be beyond or above sur the real, but also super real, more real than real, more intense than everyday reality, a Dali landscape of a memory older than memory, of a memory persisting in memory, of a dream in life. It is an eerie world, which is to say, a strange and fearful one. Something is eerie when it leaves one uneasy, when there is a certain ambiguous and undifferentiated menace, an undercurrent of frightening unfamiliarity, not unlike a Levinasian Iliad, perhaps, of night that nights, that envelops one completely. It's an uncanny world, one where the familiar is made strange, and the strange sends a chill up one's spine. All these descriptions hang together inasmuch as they evoke a disturbance in our ordinary perception of reality. They point to an experience that disrupts our sense of normalcy, and they challenge our expectations of the world and what it is, or how it is to work, or how it is supposed to work. They all unsettle familiarity. It was like a dream, a nightmare reality, one student said. But unlike the dream, or unlike the surreal of psychosis, this place is also tangibly real right here in front of me, right here. Now, we often, especially in study abroad, speak of the importance of place in study abroad, how important it is to be there. We say that no picture of David's Michelangelo can convey the experience standing in front of it, or no wildlife documentary, even it is by Sir Richard Attenborough, can kind of tell us or be the experience in the bush. But you see, in most such acknowledgements, the emphasis is either still in the subject, as in the self at the Galleria Accademia in Florence, or in an open Hilux safari in the South African Highveld. It is of the self reaching out into space, the space which is then grasped and brought into the orbit of a certain knowledge, an enriching extension of existential possibility. It is the Levinasian existent mastering existence by the grasp of understanding. It is the Rogerian self-actualizer who becomes all she can be. It is the Maslowian transpersonalist who paradoxically finds the ego by losing it in the peak experience. It is the heroic Viktor Frankl whose personalized meaning is of a heroic and Sisyphean struggle with existence to a meaningful end. But this place is not it. It's not that. I do not reach out to it. It reaches into me. It comes from an elsewhere. Here, as Primo Levi reminds us, there is no why. Here, as Levinas reminds us, there is no meaning, only useless suffering. This is a world I cannot contain in my grasp. This place has an accordance to itself. It is pathically and effectively tuned to a pitch and a vibration that is there before I arrive, before the arrival of the self. My students' data will show, and I will argue though, that it is more than just an atmosphere. It's more than the affective affordance of a place, such as in a haunted house or a cemetery or a church, where there is something in the air. This place upsets the Heideggerian relationship to space as lived in the pre-reflective know-how of being in the world. Not because the equipmentality of the pre-reflective being in the world breaks down, or the familiarity and intimacy of known space is ipso facto threatened by a new space of travel. It breaks down because of the appearance of the other, which and who intrudes on the solipsism of our engagement. We'll have to wait for theme 4 for more of that. The experience in this place tears the spatial and temporal fabric of the world. And in this experience, then, the third, what shall we call it, structure, theme, organization, a bodily experience, first and foremost. As students spoke to us, they mentioned things like, I'm walking where they were, but I can walk out. This was their first, like it is my first, but it was their last, and I can walk out. I couldn't eat between Auschwitz and Birkenau. It takes your breath away. It broke me inside. I had goosebumps. I had chills. I feel it in my chest. I was shivering. I felt suddenly nauseous, like throwing up. I don't know. My stomach just, I don't know. Now, you may say, this is not entirely new to phenomenologists. Husserl said already then that the body is the ultimate central here, always already accompanying any spatial perception I may have. And of course, Merleau-Ponty and Levinas and Fanon are poster philosophers for the, quote, givenness of the world founded in corporeal sensibility, that's Merleau-Ponty, or directedness towards the things of the world through the body. But let's be honest with ourselves, as phenomenologists, even as we say it and know it, and say, but of course we know it. How often, by the old hat of our philosophical methodologies, metaphysics, ontologies, how often don't we struggle and fail in the methodological and epistemological of such self-evidence? We remain very frequently all too seduced by the egoic elegance of our theoretical presumptions and the methodological steps of our research. The hat is old, not from use as much as it is from being on display. We make believe the specimen pinned to the board is a butterfly. One of the ways in which the body expresses itself in this corporeal way is by means of affect, and it's the core finding of our research. Now, for the psychologist like myself, it's almost rote to write a report with a sentence such as, the patient presented with depressed mood and flattened affect, though family members report a history of emotional lability. Yeah. I mention it in that kind of way because there's a psychological protocol which distinguishes between mood, affect, emotion, and feeling. I won't go into the differences now. Not only don't I have the time, and the phenomenologists also look at it a little differently from the psychologists. I will stay with the students as just stories of what it was, or what it felt. And as such, they tell a story of being overcome with emotion, of being seized by it. At some point or other during the day, we spent 8 hours in Auschwitz-Birkenau, by the way. At some other point, they quote-unquote bed down. Quote, walking up to Birkenau, I literally just said like, holy shit, and I lost it. You're like, just like, oh my God, it's real. I'm overcome. I'm surprised by it, which is to say, I'm seized by it. Surprehendere, surprise. I'm seized from an elsewhere, from an outside. And what this emotional upsurge from elsewhere does is to put the self in question. I have, even in the language of neuropsychology, that most naturalistic of psychologists, we can say that the oldest, the most primal system in our brains, the limbic system, is stimulated. It sends a signal to the lacrimal glands to produce tears, which well up, it overpowers the tear ducts, and it spills over the eyelids and down our face. And our newest, our most recent evolutionary gift, the prefrontal cortex, the distinguishing seat of meaning, reason, and personality, in this moment, has no power and simply stands by, a bystander, waiting its turn, like the detective late to the scene, or the psychologist late to the scene for that matter, to make belated sense of the event as witness, not participant. The character of this experience is of an exposedness. There's the unsettling sense of being invaded, of being touched, of the border of the body being transgressed. It is a haunting, ghostly, eerie, unreal, surreal, uncanny presence. And as Freud told us already so long ago, it is a presence before which we shudder, before which we tremble. An occasion in which we encounter ourselves as doppelganger, as double in front of ourselves. We are put out of our home, lest us English speakers forget what you already know, that the unheimliche is to be put out of heim, out of home, is to give up the geheim, the secret of the interior home. The unheimliche, the uncanny, is for the secret of the repressed and das Trieb to spill out, such that the body shudders, it quakes, it shivers, it tingles down the spine. The hair on the back of one's neck stands up. One cries. These are not tears of sympathy. They aren't tears of empathy. Any intro to psych textbook will tell you that sympathy is a feeling with, empathy is a feeling with, sympathy is a feeling for. There is no here for empathic understanding, nor is there a sympathetic sorrow which is not banal. But more than that, empathy and sympathy as feeling states emerge from the self, from me. There is a distance in pity and sorrow, for example. There's no motivation to act upon the feeling. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss is most often accompanied by an unacknowledged saying, sure as hell ain't glad it ain't me. Yeah. This experience does not come from me. There is here an externalization of myself to myself, an acknowledgement of others whose suffering has found a way into my bodily and affective acknowledgement. In this pathic and corporeal face-to-face of self and world, there is a knowledge that cannot be taught as much as it has to be learned. Now, before I go to the last one, I was reminded that I made reference to this neurological cascade by which we produce tears. Well, even there, wouldn't you know it, there are different kinds of tears. There are basal and reflex tears, to keep the eyes lubricated, for example, or to flush out foreign particles, and so our tears contains antibodies, like lipocalin, which is a protein, an antibody protein. And then there are emotional tears, the scientists tell us. Social tears. Natural science tells us their composition is entirely different. They compose of neuropeptides and hormones and neurotransmitters, including those implicated in memory and attachment. And what neuropsychology is unable to articulate, I believe Derrida does when he writes, quote, that Antigone's tears reminds us that the eyes are not for seeing, but for crying. That is to say, we are in the realm of ethics as first philosophy. The experience for all participants was not merely an educational trip, but an ethical encounter. And I'm going to wrap up rather quickly because I see time is catching up on me. This sense of unease is in this imperative to answer to the dead and before the dead. The place materializes its trauma in its spatiality, its runes, and its effective concordance. I feel the victims. They look at me. What do they think of me walking here? There's a sense of a burden, a weight now, an obligation to the victims and to history, a weight that now requires me to speak, to act. Witness and testimony go together, and as Agamben says, testimony, agency has passed to the dead. That makes me speak. To testify is to be transformed from a learner into a witness. This is a powerful shift from a passive recipient of knowledge to an active bearer of testimony. Now, what I am saying, if it isn't clear already, is not that we renounce knowledge, not that we renounce understanding. We do not abandon representation. These students have to write papers for me. They have to write in the journal. A student has to write a dissertation. They have to be scholars. They have to write. But for ethics as first philosophy, and for a ontology in a Derridian sense, for a scholarship of witness and testimony, what it means is that we use representation to reveal the failure of representation. A signification that might bear the trace of its excess. In Levinasian terms, it is to continually unsay the said for the trace of the saying. In some other places I've written about witness and testimony, and I don't want to go through it all here, but I can, if you're interested, you can write to me and I'll give you references to those articles. But suffice it to say that testimony is not a bringing back in the representational sense of a copy, as much as it is a recuperation, a reiteration, a bringing back, a seeing again and for the first time, which is to say a seeing differently, which is to say an unseeing, which is to say a response not from knowledge, but from a command to responsibility, where my response is my responsibility. In another form of Levinas's said, a building located in Endbuilding, perhaps, in another form. It is to offer a singular said from a singular encounter with the other in responsibility, and from the force of an ethical subjectivity that has been lying in wait for the singular signature for a proper name, mine. We can talk about this perhaps in the because I see my time is winding down. But so the question becomes, what did they learn? You know? And then, related to that, what are the implications for pedagogy? One of the biggest things that they learn is the limit of understanding. They try to explain it to family and friends, for example, and they say, I just don't know, but I must speak. I must say something. I put it into words. You can't really prepare for it, no matter how much you read. I can understand more, but I also understand less. I don't understand how it escalated to this. I know we talked about it in class. I know we went through the theories of how the enemy, how you become dehumanized to the point that it's easier for the perpetrators to do these things. It makes sense. But then, being there, it's just absurd. I just couldn't. And they said the same thing when I also went to Kigali in Rwanda, and the story is similar. I just want to pull one or two more on culpability. Before we went, it was how could these Hutus and Germans and Turks and whatever and other in history do this? And now it was, I would never do this, we would never do this, we would never participate in this. And now they realize and recognize themselves as culpable. It can't happen. I could do it. I sometimes ask them, so for all of your outrage, if you lived in 1688 in the South, would you be a slave owner? You know? What students learn is both that the world and time is all out of joint, but also that the weight from Hamlet or Cursed Spite, also the weight that emerges from the recognition that ever I was born to set it right. What they've been exposed to is radical alterity, which is not a question of knowing or the cognitive. It is knowing without knowing. It's a knowing by the body, and it's a knowing by response and responsibility. Thank you.